Snow falls quietly over the ruins of Europe, but there's no peace in the silence, only the hum of engines and the echo of distant gunfire. It's December 1944, and Nazi Germany, battered and cornered, refuses to die. The forests of the Ardennes groan under the weight of snow and blood. American soldiers, exhausted, frozen and outnumbered, push through the fog, their boots sinking into icy mud as artillery shells thunder above them. The Battle of the Bulge has begun. Hitler's last desperate gamble, the Luftwaffe swoops low, cutting through the clouds like iron vultures. Villages vanish in flames. Radios crackle with static and panic, messages from scattered platoons, begging for reinforcements that may never come. Every soldier whispers the same question through chattering teeth. How much longer? In Washington, D.C., beneath layers of secrecy and steel doors, another kind of battle is raging. A coded message circulates quietly among the highest ranks of the U.S. military, so classified that even generals aren't allowed to utter its name aloud. It speaks of a project that could end the war, or end everything. Far from the front lines, scientists and engineers work in silence under desert skies, their experiments whispered about like ghost stories among soldiers. To most of the world, it's just a rumor. But in dimly lit war rooms across Europe, Allied intelligence officers already sense it. Something colossal is stirring across the Atlantic. As the flames of war reach their peak, Germany believes it still holds the power to crush the Allies. But soon, it will learn how wrong it is, because when America finally reveals its secret, the very sky will become their enemy. Germany thought it had seen every weapon America could build, until the day the sky itself became their enemy. The war had entered a phase no one had predicted. By early 1945, Germany was cornered, but not broken. Cities lay in ruins, yet the Nazi war machine kept grinding forward with terrifying persistence. Every victory for the Allies seemed to cost thousands of lives, every inch of ground paid for in blood. Deep in the war rooms of Washington and London, one chilling truth began to surface. Conventional warfare might never bring Germany to its knees. Something decisive, something overwhelming, had to be created. Behind the smiling faces of public speeches and victory posters, a different kind of war was unfolding, a war fought in laboratories, universities, and secret compounds buried in the desert. The United States had quietly gathered the greatest scientific minds of the century under a single, unmarked name: the Manhattan Project. They met in quiet rooms where blackout curtains blocked the light and armed guards stood outside the doors. Physicists, mathematicians, and engineers worked with feverish intensity, scribbling calculations that could change the world or destroy it. Among them was a quiet, haunted man named J. Robert Oppenheimer, whose brilliance was matched only by his unease. Every night, as his colleagues celebrated progress, he would step outside into the desert wind and stare up at the stars, whispering to himself that mankind might be about to unleash something it could never control. The project's commander, General Leslie Groves, wasn't a man of science but of logistics and secrecy. Under his watch, entire towns appeared on no maps. Thousands of workers labored on parts they didn't understand, refining uranium, constructing reactors, building the unimaginable, each convinced they were simply contributing to the war effort. Groves made sure that no single person knew everything. It was a jigsaw puzzle of death, and only a handful of men could see the whole picture. But beyond the laboratories of Los Alamos, another silent war raged across the Atlantic. Intelligence. Officers were scattered through neutral countries, Switzerland, Sweden, and Spain, posing as diplomats, professors, even priests. Their mission was to locate and smuggle scientific data from Europe before the Nazis could seize it. Codenames and double agents filled the shadows. Allied operatives intercepted German shipments labeled as medical equipment but packed with uranium compounds. Couriers risked their lives carrying formulas on microfilm hidden inside shoe heels or hollowed-out pens. Even in occupied France and Norway, small groups of resistance fighters carried out sabotage missions to cripple Germany's heavy water plants, vital to the Nazi nuclear program. They knew the stakes. If Germany completed its atomic research first, it wouldn't just mean defeat for the Allies, it could mean the end of civilization. Inside the Manhattan Project's main facility, the tension was suffocating. Scientists debated endlessly, not about whether they could build the bomb, but whether they should. Enrico Fermi, the Italian genius who'd fled fascism, often muttered that they were meddling with forces older than mankind. "If we succeed," he once said, "we will change not just the war, but the course of life itself." And yet, the work pressed on. Every test tube, every bolt of uranium, every failed experiment pushed them closer to the unthinkable. The desert nights echoed with the sound of generators and the low hum of machines no one outside the project would ever see. Letters from family went unread, friendships dissolved, and exhaustion became routine. For the generals in Washington, this wasn't about curiosity, it was about survival. They knew Hitler's scientists were racing toward the same goal. Every day that passed was a day closer to disaster. The Allies were fighting two wars, one on the battlefield, and one in the shadows of scientific discovery. By spring of 1945, the world stood on the edge of transformation. Oppenheimer's team had split the atom, and what they found inside terrified them. They had turned matter into pure energy, energy that could level a city in seconds. It was power beyond comprehension, and it now belonged to them. Late one night, as reports of Germany's desperation reached the lab, Oppenheimer stood alone by the window. Outside, lightning flickered across the horizon, reflecting off the distant mountains. He whispered words from the Bhagavad Gita, words that would soon echo through history. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." No one in that room could yet imagine what those words would mean. But in the silence that followed, one truth settled over them all. The race to end the war had already gone too far to stop. And far across the Atlantic, Germany, still convinced of its own invincibility, had no idea that its fate was now being written, not by soldiers, but by scientists. The streets of Germany were unrecognizable. Charred skeletons of cities that once stood proud now lay buried under ash and silence. But amid the rubble and the smoke, another war was being fought, one that no headline would ever mention. It was a race through shadows, where silence was survival and every discovery could change the fate of humanity. Its code name, Operation Alsos. While Oppenheimer and his team toiled in the secret labs of New Mexico, the Allies had launched a different kind of mission deep inside Nazi territory. A small elite group of soldiers, scientists, and spies moved ahead of the front lines, under the command of Colonel Boris Pasch and guided by the scientific mind of Samuel Goudsmit. Their task was simple in theory, but deadly in execution. Find Germany's atomic research before Hitler did something unimaginable with it. The men of Alsos carried rifles, but their most powerful weapon was information. They swept through shattered towns, slipping past sniper nests and abandoned trenches, searching for laboratories, crates, and people. Every notebook, every test tube, every whisper mattered. Each clue could mean the difference between victory and annihilation. In March of 1945, the team entered a bombed-out German university. The halls were silent, except for the creak of broken glass under their boots. In one underground lab, they found a reactor core, small, primitive, but functional. Cables still hummed faintly, and the smell of chemicals lingered in the air. Scattered across a table were notes written in precise German script, calculations for uranium enrichment, sketches of a containment vessel, and words that made their hearts stop cold. Kernwaffe Project. De tout. The nuclear weapon project. The scientists they interrogated spoke in trembling voices. Some claimed the project had been abandoned due to lack of resources. Others hinted that fragments of research had been moved south to underground bunkers hidden in the Alps. And a few refused to speak at all, staring blankly at their captors as if the silence itself might protect them. Operation Alsos moved fast. The Allied front was pushing deeper into Germany every day, and the race was against time. Intelligence. Reports revealed that a convoy had left Berlin, carrying crates marked with obscure chemical symbols. The suspicion was immediate: uranium, or worse, heavy water. If Hitler's forces managed to retreat with it, they could vanish into the mountains and continue their work. The team intercepted the convoy near Haigerloch, a small town nestled in the Black Forest. Underneath an old church, they found something astonishing: a secret underground laboratory, complete with heavy water tanks and uranium cubes suspended in a lattice, a crude but real nuclear reactor. The walls still bore burn marks from hasty demolition attempts, evidence that the Germans had tried to destroy the site before fleeing. As Goldschmidt examined the equipment, his hands trembled. "They were closer than we thought," he whispered, "much closer." They discovered notes belonging to the infamous physicist Werner Heisenberg, one of the greatest minds of his generation and the leading figure in Germany's atomic research. His calculations were complex, brilliant, but incomplete. A single misjudgment in his data had slowed their progress, perhaps saving the world from disaster. Had Heisenberg made the correct assumptions about uranium mass, Germany might have built a bomb before the Allies. Still, the implications were chilling. The Nazi regime hadn't just dreamed of a wonder weapon, they had nearly built one. Every discovery tightened the noose of urgency around the Allies' necks. The scientists back in Los Alamos were working under the assumption that time was running out. If the Germans were this close, America had no choice but to finish first, no matter the cost. But Operation Alsos wasn't finished. Their mission expanded beyond Germany's borders into Austria, France, and even neutral territories. In each location they uncovered fragments of a puzzle: blueprints smuggled through train stations, test data hidden in farmhouses, vials of uranium dust buried in fields. The pieces all led to one horrifying truth. The Nazis had believed victory could come from the atom. In one of their final missions, Alsos agents captured a group of German scientists near a lakeside villa. Among them was Heisenberg himself. As he was led away, he muttered something that haunted the men for years: "If we had 6 more months, the outcome might have been different." That single sentence sent a chill through the entire Allied command. The thought of a Nazi atomic bomb, a weapon powerful enough to erase a city, was enough to keep generals awake at night. Back in Washington, reports from Alsos poured in, stamped top secret. Each one confirmed what the Allies had feared all along. The Nazis had been chasing the same terrible dream. America's secret weapon wasn't born out of ambition. It was born out of terror. The men of Operation Alsos had done their job. They had prevented the unthinkable. But what they didn't know was that their discoveries would push the United States even harder, driving the Manhattan Project to completion with ruthless urgency. Because now, there was no turning back. The Allies had proof that the enemy had tried to harness the power of the atom. And as news of the German reactor reached New Mexico, unrealization echoed across the desert laboratories. If they didn't finish first, someone else eventually would. That fear became the fuel that turned theory into fire. The race against Germany was over. But the race against extinction had just begun. The desert was quiet, eerily quiet, stretching endlessly under a pale New Mexico sky. It seemed lifeless, but beneath its surface, humanity's most dangerous creation was coming to life. Hidden deep in the heart of the Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man, a secret army of scientists, engineers, and soldiers worked under false names and false smiles. They called it Project Y. To the outside world, it didn't exist. Barbed wire surrounded the base, and guards with machine guns stood watch, even against the wind. Every truck that entered carried parts that no one questioned. Every train that left carried waste no one dared to identify. In dusty barracks and tin-roofed labs, America's greatest minds labored around the clock. The tension was palpable. Conversations were whispered, footsteps hurried, and even the desert breeze seemed to hum with electricity. Inside the lab, under harsh fluorescent lights, Robert Oppenheimer leaned over a cluttered table filled with sketches, copper wires and half-burned notes. He hadn't slept properly in weeks. His eyes, sunken and sharp, flickered with something between obsession and dread. Around him, other scientists debated over equations that could decide the fate of the world. "Do you understand what this means?" One of them asked, voice trembling. "If we succeed, we end the war," another interrupted. "Or we end everything," someone whispered back. No one answered. The hum of the generators filled the silence. Each man had been brought here for a reason: brilliance, patriotism, desperation. But as the bomb neared completion, those reasons began to fracture. Some dreamed of victory. Others feared damnation. A few wondered if they were building something even the devil would fear to use. General Leslie Groves, the military overseer of the project, saw things differently. To him, this was war. He didn't deal in ethics, only results. He walked through the labs with the precision of a man counting down to destiny. "Every day we wait," he said, "more boys die in Europe. You want to stop death? Then build me this bomb." And they did. Day and night, the desert echoed with the clanging of metal and the hiss of welding torches. Scientists constructed the core. Soldiers assembled the casing, and engineers tested circuits that could detonate with perfect precision, or fail and vaporize them all. The smallest miscalculation could trigger a disaster powerful enough to erase Los Alamos from existence. Outside, the summer heat was merciless. Inside, the cold of fear was worse. At times, Oppenheimer stood alone under the stars, watching the endless horizon of sand and sky. The desert seemed ancient, older than memory, older than war. It felt like the perfect place for humanity's first meeting with its own creation. He once told a colleague, "We're not just splitting atoms. We're splitting history." As the day of the test approached, nerves began to crack. One young technician confided in his journal that he dreamed of a flash so bright it swallowed the sun. Another confessed to smuggling a Bible into his pocket during work, just in case. A few scientists even placed bets on whether the bomb would ignite the Earth's atmosphere, a real possibility that haunted them all. Then came the night, July 15th, 1945. The desert air was hot and still. A storm brewed on the horizon, lightning flashing silently behind distant clouds. The bomb, codenamed the Gadget, was hoisted to the top of a steel tower at the Trinity site, its metallic shell gleaming under floodlights. The men moved around it like priests preparing an altar, each motion deliberate, reverent, terrified. At the control bunker miles away, rows of switches and dials awaited final input. Wires stretched across the desert floor, disappearing into the darkness. The hum of generators mixed with the low murmur of voices, some praying, some joking nervously, all waiting for history to decide what kind of men they really were. Oppenheimer stood apart from the others, staring through binoculars toward the tower. His colleague, Kenneth Bainbridge, approached quietly. "Are we ready?" he asked. Oppenheimer exhaled slowly. "As ready as we'll ever be." The clock struck 5 a.m. They began the countdown. Technicians whispered final checks. "Electrical systems green. Detonator ready. Sequence stable." Outside, rain began to fall, light, warm, like the sky itself hesitated. Some argued to delay, others insisted to proceed. In the end, the order came through. Continue. In those final minutes, the world seemed to hold its breath. Every man there understood what might come next, a weapon that could end the war, or end the world. Oppenheimer closed his eyes. His lips moved silently, repeating the words that had haunted him since he first understood the bomb's power. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. The timer hit 0, and in the suffocating silence before detonation, there was only the hum of the desert wind, the sound of humanity standing at the edge of creation, and a single heartbeat that would soon be drowned out by the birth of fire. Then, nothing. For one long second, the earth itself seemed to stop turning, and then the world exploded into light. At 5:29 a.m. on July 16, 1945, the desert that had been silent for centuries awakened with a scream of light. There was no warning, just a flash so bright that night itself seemed to die in an instant. It was as if a second sun had erupted from the heart of the earth. The sand turned white, the mountains glowed like molten metal, and every man watching instinctively dropped to the ground, covering his eyes and ears. Though nothing could truly shield them from what they had unleashed, for a moment, there was silence, total, unnatural silence. And then the world exhaled. The sound came next, rolling across the desert like thunder from a wrathful god. It was not one explosion, but a chorus of them, echoing off the canyons and mountains for miles. The air itself trembled. Men miles away felt the shockwave punch through their chests. Inside the control bunker, no one moved. The light had blinded even those who looked through protective goggles. When it faded, they saw it, a mushroom cloud clawing its way into the sky, boiling, twisting, alive. It rose higher and higher, devouring the heavens. Beneath it, the desert floor shimmered with molten glass. Robert Oppenheimer stood motionless, the reflection of the fireball dancing in his glasses. For a long time he said nothing. The other scientists stared, breathless, unable to decide whether to cheer or weep. Then, in a voice almost too quiet to hear, Oppenheimer spoke the words that would haunt the world forever. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Some laughed nervously, unsure what else to do. Others whispered prayers. A few men vomited, overwhelmed by the sight. One soldier muttered, "Dear God, what have we done?" General Leslie Groves, usually unflinching, stood in silence. He had seen battlefields drenched in blood, heard the cries of the dying, but nothing had prepared him for this. He turned to Oppenheimer and said only one thing: "It works." The desert burned for hours after. The crater where the bomb had detonated glowed faintly, a greenish hue spreading across the sand. Instruments nearby had melted. The tower from which the gadget had been suspended was gone, vaporized. When scientists approached the blast site days later, the Geiger counters screamed in their hands. What they had created was beyond measurement. As dawn finally broke over the horizon, the men of Los Alamos emerged from their bunkers. They expected to feel triumph, but what they felt instead was something colder, something hollow. They had ended a war, perhaps, but at a cost no one could yet define. The sun rose on a new kind of world, one where humanity could destroy itself with the push of a button. Thousands of miles away, across the ruins of Europe, Allied intelligence operatives began to intercept strange reports, rumors filtering through diplomatic channels. German agents stationed in neutral countries whispered of a new American weapon, one that could light up the night sky like day and leave nothing behind. In the crumbling bunkers of Berlin, those reports reached what remained of the Nazi high command. Though Hitler was gone, his generals listened in silence. The words were impossible to believe, and yet, after years of war, nothing seemed impossible anymore. "An explosion," one officer read aloud, "so bright it was seen from hundreds of miles away. The Americans are calling it a test." The room was still. The men exchanged glances. Some scoffed, dismissing it as propaganda. But others, those who had witnessed the devastation of Allied bombing raids, felt something deeper than disbelief. They felt fear. For years, Germany had boasted of its Wunderwaffe, its miracle weapons. Rockets, jet fighters, guided bombs, none of them had been enough. But this was something else entirely. The Allies hadn't just built a better weapon, they had rewritten the laws of war itself. In hidden research bunkers, captured German physicists heard whispers of the Trinity test. Werner Heisenberg, now a prisoner under Allied guard, reportedly stared at the sky that night, wondering what kind of light could turn midnight into morning. He didn't speak for a long time before finally murmuring, "They've done it." And he was right. The balance of power had shifted forever. The war in Europe was already ending, but now every German soldier, every scientist, every survivor understood the truth. They hadn't just lost the war, they had lost the future. Back in New Mexico, the fires still burned. The men of the Manhattan Project watched from a distance as smoke curled into the heavens. There was no cheering, no celebration, just the realization that they had opened a door that could never be closed. Some smiled grimly, convincing themselves that this was victory. Others wept quietly, knowing it was something far darker. Above them, the mushroom cloud continued to rise, spreading outward like a shadow over the world, a symbol of both triumph and terror. The secret weapon was no longer theory. It was no longer imagination. It was real, and from that moment forward, every nation on earth would live under its light. And its shadow, the flash that split the earth, had not just ended a war, it had begun an age of fear. The war in Europe ended before the weapon could be used. But even in surrender, Germany felt the echo of something far greater than defeat. Word spread not through newspapers, but through whispers. Officers spoke in hushed tones, prisoners overheard fragments of English radio broadcasts, and scientists held their breath when the words "atomic explosion" appeared in captured Allied documents. In the bombed-out ruins of Berlin, people were still crawling from the rubble when the rumors began, "The Americans have a new kind of bomb." Others added, "It can destroy an entire city." The phrases changed with every retelling, but one line remained the same. "They've made us son." In Allied interrogation centers, captured German physicists sat behind barbed wire, pale and silent. Werner Heisenberg stared at the floor for a long time after hearing the first detailed reports of the Trinity test. When one British officer asked if he believed it was true, Heisenberg simply replied, "If it is, then the world will never be the same again." Otto Hahn, the man who had first discovered nuclear fission, wept openly. "I wish," he said, "that I had never found it." The news rippled across the world like a second shockwave. In Moscow, Stalin listened without expression as his advisors described what had happened in the New Mexico desert. He asked few questions, only one that mattered: "Can we make one too?" His scientists knew the race for survival had already begun. In London, Prime Minister Churchill reportedly went silent when he was briefed. After a long pause, he muttered, "We have reached the precipice of annihilation." And in Washington, President Truman sat with his military staff, understanding the burden of what had been created and what was yet to come. The bomb had not been built to win a war anymore. It had been built to end all wars, yet everyone feared it might instead end humanity. Among soldiers in the field, the mood was strange, victory wrapped in unease. American troops, who had fought through the Ardennes and Normandy, celebrated their survival. But as the stories spread of a weapon that could burn the sky, their laughter grew quieter. They had seen artillery, tanks, and bombers, but this was something beyond comprehension. Some men whispered that the scientists had touched God's fire. Others said it wasn't God's fire at all. Across occupied Europe, civilians rebuilding their shattered lives looked to the West with both gratitude and terror. The nation that had liberated them now possessed a weapon that could erase cities. In the pubs of London and the cafes of Paris, people debated whether the Americans had gone too far, whether victory was worth the price of such knowledge. German scientists, now held under Operation Epsilon in an English estate called Farm Hall, gathered around a hidden radio the day they heard the full news of Hiroshima. They refused to believe it at first. "Impossible," one said. "They would need tons of uranium." But as the details came in, the blinding light, the instant death, the shadowed outlines of human forms burned into walls, silence fell over the room. Heisenberg covered his face with his hands. Otto Hahn began to cry again. Someone whispered, "Then it's over." For the German military prisoners still clinging to fragments of loyalty, it was a humiliation beyond measure. They had imagined secret rockets and miracle weapons that would turn the tide, yet the true Wunderwaffe had come from their enemy. A weapon so vast, so final, that no courage or strategy could resist it. Even among the victors, celebration was muted. The scientists who had worked at Los Alamos received congratulations and medals, but in private many could not sleep. Some had nightmares of cities vaporized in a heartbeat. Others stared for hours at the photos from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, realizing that what they had unleashed had already claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. In Germany, the defeated looked to the sky with fear, wondering if the next war would begin before they could even rebuild their homes. Children who had once been told that the Führer's scientists would bring them glory now heard a different kind of story. That the Americans had built a bomb that could light the night brighter than the sun and leave nothing behind. Mothers hushed them quickly, whispering, "Don't speak of it." The world had changed in the blink of an eye. Borders still existed on maps, but they no longer felt real. Every nation understood that survival depended not on armies or courage, but on knowledge, the knowledge to harness or to resist the atom. When the German generals signed the final documents of surrender, they thought the war had ended. But those who had seen the reports of the Trinity test, who had heard the whispers of Hiroshima, knew better. The world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would come next. And in that uneasy silence between victory and annihilation, humanity began to understand the truth. They had won the war. Yes, but they had also built the weapon that could end the world. The war had ended, but peace felt hollow. The guns had fallen silent across Europe, yet the echo of that first atomic blast still reverberated through every corner of the world. Cities were rebuilding, nations were counting their dead, and soldiers were returning home. But something invisible had shifted. Humanity had crossed a threshold, and there was no going back. In the ashes of Nazi Germany, American and Soviet officers moved quickly, seizing what remained of Hitler's scientific empire. Laboratories were stripped bare, notes and blueprints shipped in crates across the ocean. German scientists who once worked for the Reich were divided like the spoils of war. Some sent west to work for America's new rocketry and nuclear programs. Others east, vanishing into the shadows of Soviet research institutes. What began as a war for Europe had become a race for the planet itself. Operation Paperclip quietly began, and men who had built weapons for the Nazis now wore American uniforms. The Soviets answered with their own version, creating secret cities devoted entirely to atomic research. The peace that followed was not one of relief, but of rivalry. Two superpowers staring at each other across a world trembling with potential destruction. The bomb had ended the Second World War, but it had also created the blueprint for the next. In the United States, newspapers hailed victory, but behind the headlines, unease grew. Scientists who had once celebrated their success began to question their legacy. Oppenheimer himself, once the visionary behind the project, now stood before Congress warning that what they had created was not a triumph, but a terror. "Physicists," he said quietly, "have known sin." In Germany, those who survived the war could only watch as their cities were rebuilt under the shadow of a new age. Children played among the ruins of a past empire, unaware that far above them, in laboratories and missile silos, the next generation of weapons was already being born. The same scientific brilliance that had promised to change the world had now made it a hostage to fear. The image of the mushroom cloud lingered in the minds of all who had seen it, not as a symbol of power, but as a warning. The light that once split the desert now hung over the conscience of humankind, reminding everyone that victory and annihilation were separated by a single decision. As the decades ahead would prove, the war had not truly ended. It had only transformed. The battlefield had moved from the trenches to the laboratories, from cities to skies, from armies to ideologies. Germany was shocked, yes, but so was the world. Because when America unleashed its secret weapon, it wasn't just the enemy that changed. It was humanity itself.